what is the value of Bitcoin? Well, what is it? It's a certificate that you get for successfully completing a puzzle, which is they call mining. Mining is you solve this puzzle, and you burn up 77 trillion kilowatts of electricity, add a couple thousand tons of CO2 to the atmosphere, and you solve this puzzle, and you win the certificate called a Bitcoin that says you solved the puzzle. And it's very rare and very hard to get. Not very rare, but certainly hard to get. Okay, but that's all it is.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For a small donation, you can get early access to our episodes, and there will be bonus episodes in the future. You just heard my guest this week, father of modern monetary theory, Warren Mosler, with his take on cryptocurrency. In last week's show, Warren talked about what makes a currency and how taxes function in modern money systems. Wait, money? Theory? Taxes? Yawn? Hold on, give me a minute. If you're new to MMT, I 99% guarantee the way you think money comes into existence is not actually how it is in reality, and I think you'll be fascinated when you find out why. And I also think that understanding how it works in reality is our only shot at being able to call our nations democracies. To illustrate how modern money works, last week Warren used a historical example that we've talked about on this show before, the hot tax. It's documented that when British colonialists wanted Africans to work for them, instead of commanding them to do it at gunpoint, they imposed a tax liability on the population, say 10 crown a week, the crown being a manufactured coin issued by the colonialists. Hot taxes were demanded in tokens with a few different names, but Warren uses the word crown to refer to them in concept. The penalty for not paying your hot taxes was getting your hut burned down. The only place you could earn the crown was by working for the colonialists, who could manufacture and issue as many crown as they wanted, depending on the amount of work they wanted from the population. So the hot tax was ultimately coercive, but a slightly less apparently coercive means of provisioning the colonialists with workers than using direct force. Let me just say at this point, I think colonialism is bad. This historical example gets used because this mechanism where taxation drives demand for tokens and therefore creates sellers of goods and services in order to get those tokens, otherwise known as unemployment, is analogous to modern money systems. To paraphrase Warren, if you're going to have a state and you've decided you want soldiers, police, schools, etc., the question is, how does the state provision itself? In the past, a nation might conquer a territory and take slaves, or maybe you'd wake up one day on a boat with a lump in your head after a night drinking and you'd be in the British Navy as a pressed sailor. These days, we pretend to be more civilized and we use a tax system. So if taxation is primarily there to drive demand for the issuer's token, like the pound, the dollar or yen, then it follows that taxation is not there to provide the issuer with tokens to spend. Rather, it creates people willing to work for the token, allowing the issuer to spend. In the UK, the issuer is the UK government, and their token is called the pound. So, your taxed pounds don't fund government spending, it's the other way around. You have the pounds to pay taxes in your pocket or in your bank account because the government issued them in the first place. And the reason you have them in your pocket is because the government hasn't taxed it back off you yet. Just to be clear, MMT is not an argument against taxation. Taxation is necessary to give the currency value, and the currency needs to have value for the state to provision itself with things that we, hopefully democratically, all agree we need. A health system, a school system, doctors, nurses, teachers, etc. MMT might be an argument against levels of taxation that are too high on people struggling with too little, because unemployment, after all, is an unspent income story, as Warren puts it. Unemployment arises when the economy as a whole is not spending enough to employ all the resources priced in pounds, including labour, hence residual unemployment. But for me, MMT is an argument against the destructive idea that the government has or could ever run out of money. When you understand what money is and where it comes from, it frees you up to think about what the public can do with its money. For example, imagine a fully funded world-class national health service and a fully funded world-class public education system. Imagine how much that could enrich a nation. Imagine using the power of the public purse to help people who had gotten into debt to educate themselves. Imagine the different future opening up for those people, and the spending power those payments that no longer have to go into servicing personal debt could bring back into the economy. Remember, somebody's spending is somebody else's income. We start part 2 of our conversation with Warren Mosler talking about student debt cancellation. Regarding student debt cancellation, which is a hot topic this week, you recently tweeted, "I support free higher education and student debt relief, but making the ultimately false analogy of trillions for bank bailouts, quote unquote, undermines implementation, just like inapplicable proposed tax hikes for Medicare for all have kept it from being implemented." Could you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah. So Medicare for all, Bernie Sanders proposes it. Now they got a few co-sponsors finally. It's got, I don't know, $1.5 trillion or $2 trillion tax hike. He's going to tax Wall Street or something like that. And opposition to the tax hike means that, Medicare for all is dead on arrival. And the tax hike before he had that was at like personal level. So, we're going to tax the rich. We're going to increase their tax bracket. And the rich filtered down to, I don't know, 100,000 a year or something. And, people are getting that constituency that's against the tax to pay for this. And Hillary Clinton comes out and says, see, this big whopping $2 trillion tax just proves we can't afford this. We have to stay with Obamacare, which is $1 trillion less efficient, 10 times worse, and costs the country $1 trillion a year.
And it's even worse because, like you just said, it's predicted to be deflationary.
Yeah, so now if you look at it as a deflationary event, and suddenly corporations who are paying most of the healthcare, they don't have any healthcare bills. And they're competitive with each other, so it tends to lower prices to the extent there's competition. And to the extent they save the money, they don't spend it, so it's not like there's any inflation coming from that. And, they might spend some, but it's very low multiple stuff. So here you got prices coming down because of competition for businesses whose costs have just been cut, a substantial amount and, a meaningful amount. And you've got 5 million people out of work. Unemployment just went up. You raise taxes to pay for that? No. If anything, you lower taxes, right? Or you have student debt forgiveness, 1.6 trillion. Now you have the fiscal space to pay for that, right? Because you've created all these unemployed. Now the students can have all this extra money to spend. You get a strong economy. These 5 million people who are out of work from Medicare for all get good jobs. Okay, so, but you don't raise taxes. Okay, so the idea that they come out saying you raise taxes to pay for it causes it not to happen. Plus, if they ever did get their way, it would be a disaster. So it's the same thing with this student loan thing where, what was it? What did I say in there? They had I can't remember what the offset was.
Yeah, the second sentence was making the ultimately false analogy of trillions for bank.
Oh, yeah. So with the they're saying, look, if we can afford $29 trillion to bail the banks out, we can afford $2 trillion for student loan forgiveness. Okay, so it's one thing if they use military spending. That's a reasonable analogy. But if they start using the $29 trillion banks, any experts on banking or whatever point out that wasn't actually the government spending money. We didn't spend any money bailing out the banks. The $29 trillion was the Fed acting as broker. One bank would have $100 million extra. Another bank was short $100 million. They didn't want to loan it to the other bank, so they left it at the Fed. The Fed loaned it to the other bank. The Fed was acting as a broker. It wasn't spending. Okay, and so so that argument gets made. It shoots down the argument that we don't have to pay for the student loans, and so by saying, look, if we can spend $29 trillion on the banks, what you're doing is conceding that these things have to be paid for. And if we can pay for that, by saying if we paid for that, we can pay for this. So if we can say, well, actually, we didn't do that. We can't do this either. So you're making a losing argument to support your argument. That losing argument gets shot down, so your argument gets shot down. So there are two different losing arguments being made here for different reasons, but it's it's sort of the same thing. The headline progressives have all these proposals, which I agree with. They all get shot down because they all tack on these things that not only do I not agree with, they're flat out wrong, misleading, and counter agenda and counterproductive. And so the reason we don't have a progressive agenda is because the headline progressives don't understand the monetary system, don't understand modern monetary theory.
Yeah.
And that's why the conservatives are winning.
It's so frustrating and lonely to be on the progressive left and understanding MMT. I mean, it's got a lot better now. Obviously, you were kind of very much on your own in the 90s. So, this is your time now, I guess.
Whatever.
But look, we've got to do this. I'm sorry if you're bored of talking about it. But
no.
Let's go. Let's talk about cryptocurrencies. We'll try and keep it as fast as possible. Now, the way into it that I'm going to go is say the key insight is that taxes drive currency from inception. So given that, and people aren't taxing in cryptocurrencies, aren't cryptocurrencies commodities and not currencies?
Well, I wrote a paper published, post-Keynesian journal, but not like my other paper that was published in the mainstream journal, but it's a long time ago, in 1998. It said, and it was talking about a general framework for the analysis of currencies and other commodities. So I'm not saying currencies are commodities, but they can be analyzed with the same framework, the same tools. So in that sense, currencies and commodities are the same. Okay, now there might be other technical differences, but currency and commodities can be analyzed in the same framework. But yes, today's currencies are tax credits, and the cryptos are not tax credits. But gold is not a tax credit. Diamonds aren't tax credits, and Renoirs aren't tax credits. So you have other collector's items, stamps. You're a stamp collector; those aren't tax credits.
Well,
why do they have
investment vehicles, right?
Why? Why would you call them that? Because where's the value come from? Because it's all the greater fool theory. Yeah, I'm a fool for buying it, but I think if a greater fool will come along and pay me more. So either you invest in because you like them and you think they're pretty, and so it has aesthetic value, like a painting, and that's not greater fool. That's just, even if you never sold it, you're getting aesthetic value from having it on your wall and looking at it. And there are plenty of people who won't ever sell them because they like to look at them. They don't even have them valued. Okay, so and whether they're investment vehicles or not, I mean, I've got one of my son's drawings up on the wall, and that has value to me. So value is value. So I'm not saying these things don't have value. So what is the value of Bitcoin? Well, what is it? It's a certificate that you get for successfully completing a puzzle, which they call mining. Mining is you solve this puzzle, and you burn up 77 trillion kilowatts of electricity, add a couple thousand tons of CO2 to the atmosphere, and you solve this puzzle, and you win the certificate called a Bitcoin that says you solved the puzzle. And it's very rare and very hard to get. Not very rare, but certainly hard to get. Okay, but that's all it is. Now, if that's valuable and somebody else wants it and wants to pay you more dollars for it, fine. Not arguing with that. And now all of a sudden, India is opened up to Bitcoin for whatever reason. I just read an article, and that's why just jumped from $3,000 each to $12,000, because all these people in India are buying these things, tripping over themselves to get this collector's item. So it's a collector's item, like stamp collecting or anything else like that, artwork. It's that type of thing. It's not like it can't have value and it has to go to zero as long as people are willing to collect it. I suspect that people are going to get tired of this thing. Like certain stamps, their value goes to zero. They might be hot one day and then the next day nobody cares, or whatever. Certain collector cars might trade for $1 million, and then a couple of years later, the same cars, a couple 100,000, and then it's going because everybody's forgotten it. Nobody cares anymore. And so, I think Bitcoin's going the same way. It's just like it doesn't have any intrinsic value. It's got some aesthetic value, like I just explained, if you want to call that aesthetic. And there's a speculative thing going on. People, you see speculative run-ups and all kinds of things that disappear later and nobody cares anymore.
It's the hype cycle.
Yeah, and that's fine, and that's part of life, and that's what it is. But that it doesn't affect the government's ability to provision itself with its own currency. And so there's no reason for the government to care, except that it thinks people might get hurt, like a virus or something would hurt, make people sick. So you have Center for Disease Control. So you might think, so you try to protect people against fraud or something, which you think can ultimately hurt them. Or if it's a transfer of wealth to some con artist who invented this thing, you might watch just to prevent it, but not because it's going to affect the function of the state. That's not going to have anything to do with the state.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's people out there who think, eventually a currency like the dollar will go to zero, and then people who are holding this Bitcoin will, they'll still be saved from that. And it makes no sense to me.
It might. If some guy's got diamonds in his toothpaste tube, and someday there's nuclear war, and he manages to crawl out, and there are no currencies anymore, so he did the right thing, so to speak. So I can't argue against that. So
in that post-apocalyptic landscape, who wants a diamond?
Yeah, right. I don't know, but maybe somebody wants it so he can win some.
I'm thinking food might be more important at that point. That's just me. I'm fussy. I like.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's the most important thing, but if you're trying to get a date and you can want to take her out to dinner, or you want to get a diamond or a gold ring, I don't know which one's going to be more important.
Hey, let's go on a date and look at all the corpses.
Yeah, people have a lot of things a lot of drive. I think that gold, a lot of the value is jewelry, right? I don't know. I've never bought gold jewelry, but somebody's buying it. Status symbols,
Yeah.
So that that has value because people are biological and they have a biological element to them, and there's certain status symbols, and there's certain celebrity status, and you got John Kennedy's golf clubs or something that they have certain value. So that's just nature of man, and it's probably an adaptive trait if you trace it back far enough.
The recent change is that there's this currency that's being planned at the moment by Facebook, Libra.
Well, legally, these things fall under the definition of currency.
Yeah.
So U.S. law, there's a definition of currency which affects how they're taxed. So, you don't pay taxes on currency profits, like that type of thing. Uh-huh. You pay taxes on profits of what you're buying and selling. And then you can I can make a payment to you and there's no sales tax. If I owe you $100 and I pay you, there's no sales tax on it. There's no transactions tax on it. And so that way, you can buy and sell these things without sales taxes, for example. So they're legally treated as a currency, which gives them some traction for mercantile purposes. They're also a vehicle for avoiding taxes. Because if I want to buy something from you and you want to avoid VAT, we can do it with Bitcoin. But the interesting thing is that doesn't give Bitcoin any value. Because the way we would do that is, I would buy Bitcoin for, let's say you wanted to get paid in dollars, $100, and at the same time you would sell $100 worth of Bitcoin short. Then I bought $100 worth, I give them to you, you deliver them to cover your short sale and get your $100, back. And so now the $100 has gone from me to the exchange to you. Neither one of us cares what the price of Bitcoin is. We can do fractional or whatever to make it come out to $100. And it's just kind of the vehicle, like PayPal, something like that, to transfer money from one person to another by using a buy-sell agreement instead of a money transfer agreement. By using a buy-sell agreement, you avoid detection and taxes. You can avoid taxes. You haven't legally avoided taxes, but you've avoided detection.
Right.
And every time you break into an exchange, they discover all this tax avoidance that was going on. And safety is another thing, but it doesn't. But our transaction didn't determine value because I bought them, you sold them at the same time at the same price. They just pair off. We call that a round robin transaction. So again, there's no intrinsic value to a Bitcoin, even for exchanging these things. You don't care if the Bitcoin is 1,000 or 100 or a million. It doesn't matter. For moving currencies around the world. And so they're used for that.
this is kind of asking you to look into the crystal ball a little bit here, but if Libra ever gets off the ground because it's a Facebook thing, is that different to any of the other cryptocurrencies just because Facebook's scale and its international character? Does that change it at all?
There may be a lot more people use it for some reason. I'm not sure why anybody would use it, but there could be. I think it's just going to be convertible into dollars or something. So I'm not sure why people would use it. Maybe, again, because you can transfer it faster than you can transfer dollars. So if I buy $100 worth of Facebook Libra, and I want to transfer it from my account to your account, maybe I can do that instantly. Or if I want to transfer dollars from my account to your account, it might take 3 or 4 hours going through the banking system. Or it might take 3 days, something, I don't know. Going internationally through the banking system with Facebook, it could get done. The Libra can get transferred instantly, and then you could get dollars instantly at your location. So it might have value, be useful for that. But then Facebook would get a fee. It doesn't mean the Libra is going to go from $1 each to $2 or $3. I think it's just going to have a fixed amount of value. It won't be like Bitcoin that changes price all the time. It'll just be one convertible at one price. I think that's what they're going to do with it, but I don't know. I mean, I don't have a seat on the board there or anything.
Great. As people start to understand that the government can't run out of money, MMT style, we're starting to see more and more of the universal basic income people say, why would you force people to work for income with the job guarantee? Why don't you just give us spending money to consume with, because of robots, etc. Completely missing the automatic stabilizer price anchor function of the job guarantee. How do you respond to those kind of talking points?
All right, so let's go back to the beginning. The British go into Africa. I use that on this podcast, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I get confused sometimes.
You definitely.
Whether I said that in Scotland when I talked or whether I said it just an hour ago. So, and they say, okay, there's a tax in your hut, 10 crown a month on everybody's house. But, why should you have to work growing coffee? We're just going to give you 10 crown a month as basic income. So now you don't have to go to work. It's like, okay, what's the crown worth? Nothing. What's the point? There's no point. You might as well not have tax to begin with. Yeah. Okay, so to the extent that's what we're doing, the reason everybody's working and needs money is because the government's trying to provision itself. It needs people looking for paid work so it can have soldiers and everything else. So if we just say, okay, we'll just give everybody the money instead of having them come work and serve in the army, then you don't get anybody to serve in the army. The state can't provision itself, and there's no currency. You may as well not have done anything. No tax, no spending, no currency. And just let everybody else go back to barter or whatever else they were doing. Whatever the world would do without a currency and without a central government. So, I know some people might think that's a good idea, but I suppose you could go to Somalia and find out someplace like that. You might not like it so much when you don't have central, authority. But anyway, okay, the tax is 10 crown a month. Let's say we only give them 5. Now they still have to work for 5. Okay, well, that's true. So as long as your basic income isn't enough to cover the tax liability, you're still going to get a currency, but you're diminishing what's available, how much the government can spend. It's not that it's going to run out of money, but there's not going to be things for sale. You're reducing what's for sale. All those people who were looking for work, offering their labor for sale, are not going to be doing it anymore. Now they're not available to be hired by the government. So we ask the larger question, which is causing this thing. Okay, the government creates a tax, like the British, and then they have more people come to grow coffee than they want. So they only hire the ones they want, and they send the others back. Well, that means the economy doesn't have enough to pay taxes, right? Because otherwise they wouldn't have been showing up for work to pay taxes and to save whatever they want. And so there's going to be a shortfall, and somebody's going to get their house burned down. Well, why would they do that? Well, they didn't. They either gave everybody who showed up a job, which is a job guarantee, right? Or they lowered the tax. So not so many people showed up. When there wasn't a tax, nobody showed up, right? So as you increase the tax, you got more and more people showing up because the need is larger and larger. And so what we have in the U.S. today is we have a tax structure that's generated, 10 million unemployed, and then the government only hires 3 million. So we got 7 million who are still out there unemployed because the tax was too strong for the spending. Okay, and so it creates a need to pay taxes and a desire to save, and that tax was just too much for the amount that the government wanted to spend. So either we hire those other 7 million people, or we reduce taxes and let them go back to the private sector. Okay, and so we're starved for public services. We hire more people. Okay, because we got them. We created the unemployed. Or if we're not starved for public sector, then we lower taxes and they go back. Well, the problem is if you lower taxes and send them back, they're damaged goods. Once somebody's been caused to be unemployed by the state's tax liability, the state has damaged them in that the private sector doesn't like to hire people who've been unemployed. They just don't like to do it. They'd rather hire somebody else. So to make them employable again, you put them in this, what I call the transition job, the job guarantee. And now that they're working, they have a track record. So an employer knows if they come in on time every day, if they get in the fights, if they're clean, whatever. If they get along with people, if they have a supervisor they can talk to, and they get hired. And study after study has shown this is exactly what happens. So by putting people in a job, you are promoting the transition from state-caused unemployment back to the private sector. And you're moving people out of the public sector because the unemployed are in the public sector. The tax moved them from the private sector to the public sector. And now you're shifting them back to the private sector. So, I think I get universal support for this. It doesn't matter whether you're liberal or conservative or anything else. The idea that once you understand the monetary system and how the tax created excess of unemployment, the idea you then either want to hire them or send them back, everybody agrees with. Now, the disagreement might be whether we want more public services or send them back to the private sector. But once there's a political consensus on that, there's no question that that you are going to be sending people back to the private sector, and so you want to put them in a transition job to make that more effective. And by making it more effective, you're also reducing inflationary tendencies. Because when the unemployed aren't hireable, then you're faced with inflationary labor shortages, even with high levels of unemployment, because they're not considered employable. But once they're all considered employable, then they're more liquid, they're more fungible, they're more employable, then you're stabilizing labor prices. And so you're eliminating the system. One of the reasons why we have a tendency towards inflation and why we have higher and higher levels of unemployment each cycle for the same amount of inflation, because this is just, it's one of the factors contributing. So when you recognize the transition job, the job guarantee in the first instance works to stabilize labor prices and reduce inflation, then again, you've got consensus from both sides. Okay, this is a good thing. Nobody thinks that's a bad thing. Now, what you don't want to do is keep labor down. And so you want the transition job wage, which automatically becomes a minimum wage in the economy, to be some kind of living wage with reasonable benefits. But it's going to stay there. It's not going to accelerate up because it's there. Because you have this big liquid pool of labor flowing back and forth to the private sector. It's going to it's going to stabilize at whatever level you set it at. So you might get a one-time price adjustment, but you're not getting inflation, which is a continuous adjustment. So you've reduced your inflationary tendencies. You've stabilized labor at a living wage, which can be increased by productivity increases every year, like we used to before the mid-'80s. And then the labor share can stay stable without any inflationary pressures. So it opens the door for all that. I hope I haven't been rambling on too much about this.
Not at all. Not at all.
But the idea that it's a fiscal stabilizer is nice. That, quote, helps the authorities a little bit, because as the economy picks up, they'll get hired away. So that cuts government spending, which tends to slow things down. And if you're in a good economy, you want to make sure that you don't let that slow things down, that you would then act to make sure that the recovery isn't aborted because of that automatic fiscal stabilizer. So it can cool things down if the economy is overheating, but it can also cool things down before the economy is overheating, depending on how aggressive the fiscal stabilizer is. And you don't want to do that. You want to stay at full employment all the time to optimize your real wealth, which is your domestic output plus imports minus exports, right? So you want to always optimize that. So you want to make sure this automatic stabilizer, in an expansion doesn't prematurely cut you down. And so now as things go bad and the people get laid off in the economy for whatever reason and the job guarantee pool goes up, yes, that helps to, it's fiscally expansionary. It causes a deficit to go up, but it's a fairly slow process. I would think you'd act proactively well ahead of that with some kind of, tax cut or public service increase or something. But if you don't, it's there to catch you. And what's happened historically is the authorities don't act because they think interest rate policy is going to work, and they leave it all to the automatic stabilizers. And so we get, pretty bad swings and counterproductive swings with massive lost output and all kinds of, human misery because of this. That's why I've called it a crime against humanity, what we're doing to ourselves.
Yeah, I'd agree. Well, I also think that the kind of MMT advocate you get, it depends on whether they've grasped your first point, which is the MMT money story starts with a government trying to provision itself. If you don't start it there, you don't. Twitter is terrible for this. People jump in halfway through an exchange, and they might seize upon, oh, you're saying the government creates unemployment, and it's like, no, yeah,
no, it's true.
But you've got to work it back to why it's doing that. And if you don't start with the state wanting to provision itself, then you don't get to the job guarantee at the other end. You might even get job guarantee advocates who are MMTers, but if they're not tying to the idea that the government created the unemployment in the first place, and it's just returning you to the state you were in before it started messing around with you, you're not going to be giving it your best shot at advocating for it.
Yeah, and for any of these policies to go through, you've got to win the debate against some reasonably sophisticated people. Yeah. You can win the debate against zealots who just want everybody to have a job. That's fine, but it's not going to make it happen.
Yeah.
You're going to get people on the other side who are reasonably sophisticated, Fed-type people and commercial bankers and everything else. And, I've been doing that for 30 years and, winning the argument every time. I mean, there's just no dispute at that level. When I talk to any of those people, they entirely agree with me. Okay, well, they won't entirely agree with Bernie Sanders when he starts making his argument, or Elizabeth Warren, or Donald Trump, or any of these other people, right? Because they're all out in space somewhere. And so, but this is bulletproof. What I'm telling you is bulletproof. It's withstood the test of time and against the highest level of counterparties.
You had a really good conversation with Dylan Moore and Nima Major at the Volitional Science Network about how the primary dealer system works in the US. Yeah. And long story short, it's a clever workaround of some rules in place that would otherwise hamper the US government in funding itself. You can tell me whether you agree with that interpretation or not. But the second thing I was going to ask you is, do you know if the primary dealer system works in the same way in the UK? Yeah,
I think it does.
Okay.
I think they've all done it because otherwise they wouldn't be functioning. So you look at the U.S., okay, we do $1 trillion tax cut, Treasury bonds get sold, no problem, doesn't matter. The government's threatening a shutdown, everything gets sold, the interest rates drop. So there's something going on that's causing all this to function. We finance the Vietnam War and doesn't affect anything, and interest rates or the ability to do it. It seems like every time Reagan said if the deficit ever gets over 90 billion, we're doomed. Well, somehow it got way over that. There isn't any doom. And this stuff, like we used to say, it goes in and out like water. And so it works. So you can't, if you want to start off and say, the government's on the knife's edge any day now, the market might do this and it might not be able to fund itself. We're at 22 trillion. I think if that was going to happen, that day would have come and gone a long time ago. Okay, and it's the same in every other country. We went through the 2008 crisis in the UK and credit default swaps going up and all that. And it never happened, right? You were always able to just run the gilts through like water. The yield curve went negative and everything. There were lower yields than there were on the bank rates. And so, at a practical level, something's working, and it's been working for a very long time. And maybe you don't understand it, but to make a statement saying this thing could collapse anytime, you have no evidence for that. There's no empirical or no shred of evidence. And every once in a while, an auction will fail, and they'll go, They tried to sell them and couldn't do it. This is it. It's going to happen. And it doesn't happen. It's just the next auction goes through. And it's like the failed auction never even happened. All right, because it's some technical thing. So all the evidence shows you that it's not like some catalyst is going to tip this thing and it's going to go the other way. The evidence shows you it's a very, very stable equilibrium here that 1 or 2 basis point move gets reversed. It's not like it moves 10%, but luckily comes back. The yield goes from 2 to 201 to 202, but comes back to 2. It only moved like a couple hundredths before it snaps back. So there's a very robust thing going on underneath it. So whether you understand what I'm talking about or not, on a practical level, that's what's happening. Now, if you look at the spreads in Italy or the Eurozone of member nations, not the ECB selling 90-day notes, which is, which is the issuer, selling its own debt. But if you look at the U.S. states, we've seen them blow out. California, Massachusetts, all of a sudden they're having trouble funding themselves. We see that all the time. We see it with Italy and Greece and Spain. They're always having trouble with that. So you could say there's something different going on there between Greece and the United States, and not say that the United States is in danger. I would not conclude the United States is in danger of becoming Greece. I would say there's something very different going on. It only started happening in Greece after the European Union. Before the European Union, when the Greek bonds were at 20% or whatever, they had no problem. They do zillions of drachma at 22%. They did whatever the policy rate was, and that it just stayed at the policy rate. If it went to 6, they were at 6. If it went to 20, they were at 20. There was never any stress or ability to sell or anything like that. But as soon as they joined the European Union, things changed. So to me, my conclusion is there's something different going on. The U.S. is not going to become Greece, and unless it joins the European Union or something. But under today's circuit, and neither is the UK. The UK kept its own currency. It didn't happen the way it happened with Greece. Okay, the European Central Bank, it doesn't happen to them. They spend and borrow whatever they want. It doesn't affect anything. Okay, and so on the surface, there is no problem. Anybody who tells me the U.S. is constrained and something bad's going to happen, it's like, no, they're not, because it would have happened. Go away. It's just some story that's not incomplete. Okay, and so in the U.S. it doesn't happen, in the UK it doesn't happen, and part of the story is the primary dealer system ensures that it won't happen. And if something happens to the primary dealer system, they'll just move to something else. They always did in World War II. They moved to something else. They always move to something to make sure it happens, because it's just a spreadsheet. They're just making debits and credits on their own spreadsheet. So if there's a policy that says you can't make this debit or credit and you need to make it, Congress says, okay, go ahead and make that debit or credit. Right now, there's a policy that says the Treasury can't have an overdraft in its Fed account. If that became a problem, Congress would say, okay, never mind, you can have an overdraft. It's not like we'd have to go to the World Bank and get permission, or go to the IMF and beg permission. This is just self-imposed constraint. You could have money in your left pocket and your right pocket, 100 pounds in each pocket, and you say, I'm never going to spend the money in my left pocket. You spend your 100 pounds, and you need another 10 pounds to eat, and you say, I'm starving, I can't eat. Well, at some point you're going to say, you know what, I'll spend the money in my left pocket, because it's all your money, right? So not that it's all the state's money, they're just debiting and crediting, but it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
The Treasury and the Fed are all agents of Congress, and Fed operates under the Federal Reserve Act of Congress. They're all controlled. It's a left pocket and a right pocket type of thing, and they can change their own rules anytime they want. They can say the Navy's not allowed to fly in Air Force helicopters. Okay, but if the war starts and they needed them to, they can change the rules and say, okay, they can fly in the Air Force helicopters. So we have all kinds of self-imposed constraints all the time. You say, well, if we go into a war, we're going to lose because we're not allowed to fly. They'll change the rule, probably. Okay, so we have a rule now that's this primary dealer network that says the primary dealers have to bid in the auctions if you want to be a primary dealer. And if you don't want to be a primary dealer, fine, but the largest accounts who deal with you require that you be primary dealers. They're only allowed to deal with primary dealers. And so if you want to do their business, you're going to have to do this. And they say, okay, so you got 20 or 30 or whatever it is today, primary dealers. You have to bid in the auctions, and you have to have a certain market share. And if you don't, you get dropped out. So they do it, and they compete with each other to bid. And usually the yields for the treasuries are lower than the government's policy rate. Look at the treasury bill rates; they're lower. And so they've got this system set up, which kind of forces private sector agents to lose money. It's basically, at least when I was at Bankers Trust, we were a primary dealer. It was always a money loser, but we had to do it or we were going to lose our large customers. And so engages in this money losing activity with the Fed in order to, preserve its large customers. And they all do it. And so the stuff goes in and out like water and there's never any issue, period. And so nothing needs to be changed. You can leave this alone. It's going to be okay.
I think there's a line of text somewhere in some document put out by the Bank of England that says something like they're not obliged to bid in every auction. They don't have each primary dealer doesn't have an obligation to bid in every auction.
Yeah. So if they didn't, and there was a problem, they could change the rule if they wanted to or whatever.
Yeah.
But obviously that doesn't create a problem. They're doing it anyway for whatever reason.
Sure.
Right. And the Bank of England's been doing it for 300 years or something.
Exactly. Yeah. Back to that point. Yeah.
I was talking to Charles Goodhart once about the debt or something, and he says, being unsustainable or something. He goes, yes. He says they've been telling us that for 300 years now. So fine. There's always vestigial things in the system, and Trump is very good at finding that.
Right.
People act civilly in court, but there's no law that says you have to do that. Or they honor if Congress subpoenas you, you go. It's not. You don't have to do that. Well, everybody does it. Well, as soon as he says, well, I'm not going to do it because it's not a law, they change the law. They change the procedures to compel them to do it. They'll put a new act of Congress through or something. Now, so there's always 1,000 things that are done by custom that are formally not law. But if they ever become an issue, they'll make them law. But you're not going to go back and change thousands of laws for things that are already functioning perfectly well by custom, right? Just don't do it. So I just don't want to get in those arguments. I know operationally, Congress is not constrained. They've got vestigial self-constraints, self-imposed constraints on themselves in all kinds of places that they'll remove on an as-needed basis. But, I'm not going to worry about those right now. We understand them. We know what they are. We know that they're not having an effect at the moment. We know that they could possibly have an effect if Congress decides to have them. But look, Congress can decide. What we say is the government has the ability to pay at all times. They might not have the willingness to pay. Congress owes money to somebody. They might decide not to pay, not because they can't, because they don't want to. They might decide not to pay, not because they can't change their policy on overdrafts for the Treasury, but because they don't want to pay. If they don't want to pay, if they want to pay, they'll change the overdraft rule. If they don't want to pay, they won't pay. And so they're not going to want to pay but not be able to. It's not like, I really wanted to pay. I would have done everything I could, but I couldn't pay. That's never going to happen. It's like, if Congress doesn't pay and make arrangements to have things paid, it's because they didn't want to. It's not because there was any obstruction in the process or anything. If the Bank of England wants to make a payment, they're not going to not payment because the primary dealer system broke it down. They're going to change the policy to pay it. If either you want to pay or you don't. If you want to pay, you do what it takes to pay. If you don't want to pay, you don't. You don't need any excuse. You just tell them you're not going to pay. You're not going to pay your debtors because the money's in your left pocket instead of your right. Well, okay. That's because you don't want to pay. You say, well, I can't pay you. There's no money in my right pocket. That's my paying pocket. My left pocket is my savings pocket. Guy goes, no. It's because you don't want to pay. It's not because you have the ability to pay.
You wrote an amazing introductory book, The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy, and it's free on your website, moslereconomics.com. And we don't have time to do all 7. So could you say off the top of your head which you think is the most important deadly innocent fraud to get people started on MMT, if you had to pick one?
Well, I used to think it was the first one, which is, everybody in Congress, all the MPs think they have to get money to be able to spend. They can't get money through taxing. They have to borrow it, but somehow they have to get the money to be able to spend it when it's not true. What we've shown is that it's the economy that needs the government's funding to be able to pay the tax. The UK economy needs pounds from the UK government to be able to pay the tax. And so, in fact, the government spends first, and only after that can taxes be paid or bonds purchased. And it's like the movie theater, right? They don't collect the ticket first and then sell it. They know they have to sell the ticket first and then collect it. So, or the football stadium. So it's something we observe everywhere, that if you're the source, you've got to get it out there before you can collect it. And so I used to think that was the most important thing. But now I think it's the one about trade. I mean, right now we've got a tariff man, Agent Orange, I call him. Or maybe Sputnik might be a good nickname for the guy. So anyway, he's got the idea that, when you go shopping, look, we all know that when you go shopping, you win if you get a better price. Okay? So whoever will sell you at the lowest possible, if you can get the lowest possible price, you're the best shopper. Right? So meanwhile, he's coming down on Canada because they're not charging us enough for lumber. He's coming down on China because they're not charging us enough for all the stuff they're selling us. And they're outlaws because they're not charging enough. It's like, what? All right, well, is that the fourth deadliest in fraud? I get the numbers confused. The trade deficit is a benefit, not a cost. It's a good thing, not a bad thing. Okay, imports are real benefits. Exports are real costs. And if you're importing and you have people who are unemployed, that's a good thing because now you can use your fiscal policy by lowering taxes or increasing public services to redeploy them into higher value activity. And so that's like an opportunity. And that's why we're all on the phone talking podcasts and not out growing food, because it used to take 99% of the people to grow food. But now we've had massive productivity increases, and 1% of employment in the United States is for food, and we're a big exporter. Okay, and the other 99% can do other things. And so productivity increases free you up to do other things. And imports is like a productivity increase. You're getting more things without having to work for it. And that frees you up to do other things. And that's one of the reasons the U.S. standard of living is where it is. We've got the rest of the world giving us $600 billion worth of stuff every year that we don't have to make ourselves. And we're freed up to do healthcare or be lawyers and sue each other or be stockbrokers and call each other up and harass each other. We're free to do all those other things, that we've so wisely used our institutional structure to create. But, that's a different issue, right? But we are, but it keeps us from having to, it releases those chains that were keeping us employed, growing food and doing manufacturing and all these other things. Now we're free to all these other wonderful endeavors of our own choosing. Okay, and he doesn't know that. And the second thing he's doing is doesn't have an appreciation of the necessity of the rule of law. If you don't like the law, fine. And I don't like most of the laws, and I'm always advocating for changing the laws. But overall, I understand and respect the need for rule of law, particularly coercive taxation. Because if you don't have that, if you don't have collective action and you don't have a police department and you don't have defense and you don't have a legal system, now you have a lawless society, and you can very easily go from a lawful society, a society that runs on the rule of law, to one that doesn't. And we've seen it happen all around the world, time after time. Look at Venezuela, and it's so easy to go backwards and so difficult to go forward. That's what worries me, that we've been backsliding for a long time, and I don't see any examples of it going in the other direction, which is more recognition of the need for the rule of law. Whether you like the laws or not is a different issue, and as opposed to not having it at all. And so we've got two major problems right now. One is that maybe are more important than the first deadly innocent fraud. One is the deadly innocent fraud that exports are benefits and imports are costs. I mean, if exports were the benefits, you'd say, okay, at the extreme, let's export everything and not import anything. Then what happens? Like, everybody dies. You have nothing left. You have no food. You have no clothes. You have nothing. So obviously, they're a cost. And if you imported everything and didn't export anything, well, then you wouldn't have to work. You'd have it'd be great. So, but no, if you're got an army and you win the war, the other guy sends stuff to you. You don't send stuff to him. So it's pretty obvious that imports are the benefits and exports are the cost, if you take a step back and look at it. But because we don't understand the monetary system, particularly the president and all his advisors and all the bankers and all the members of Congress, because the left is just as protectionist as he is, protecting workers from foreign competition, all that complete nonsense. That frees up workers to be able to do better, higher paying things. And that's why we've gotten to where we were. And they're killing the goose that's laying the golden egg. And they're doing it big time. Right now, it sure looks like we may have already got into massive global recession because of this guy. And it's not his fault. He's a 6-year-old case of arrested development, never got past 6 years old. But everybody around him basically agrees with this policy, and that China's been taking advantage of us by not charging us enough. I'm looking at this like, where's the opposition to that statement? And there isn't any. Okay, globally, there's no opposition to that. It's like, okay, the U.S. finally woke up. The fact that we've been getting ripped off, it's like, no, we haven't. It's like that game as a kid you play, who can touch the other person the softest. And so I say, okay, you go first and you touch me really soft, and I hit you as hard as I can. And I say, okay, you won. So yeah, we're whoever exports the most wins. Okay, you guys win. Okay, but we're getting all the stuff. We're punching them in the face. They're doing all the work, and we're getting all the stuff. Well, anyway, so
that reminded me of you said the
I think
left.
I've answered your question. Yeah.
I think you did. You reminded me that when you said the left doesn't seem to get this, and it reminded me of the chat that you had with Steve Keen.
Oh yeah.
He didn't seem to get it either. He was
thinking that if you buy a Mercedes, somehow the Bank of England would convert the pounds to euro.
Yeah.
Internally automatically or something. And there is no such thing. And so that would be a convertible currency. And yes, under convertible currency, you've got to net export, to sustain your reserves. But that's what defines a convertible currency. And he was throwing that in as part of a floating exchange rate policy, the very thing that defines convertibility, which, I completely agree, changes the argument. But our discussion was under floating exchange rates, today's floating exchange rates, how does it work? And so what I've been talking to you about is only possible or is possible under floating exchange rates, which is the base case for analysis. If you want to throw in a modification and say, okay, Bank of England's going to convert currency and, fine. Well, now you're going to have all kinds of issues that arise to your detriment of your real standard of living. That's one of them. So I agree with that. So that was the discussion. So he had an incorrect understanding of how the accounts cleared at the Bank of England, and that was why we had a difference in the outcomes of our thinking. We should be in sync now. Once he recognizes under floating exchange rates that's not the case, and then I would imagine he's in complete agreement. Because if he's not in complete agreement with me, he's just wrong.
I can't see this becoming controversial at all, Warren.
Yeah. There's no dispute here. It's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
All right. Well, it's been great to talk to you, and thanks for all your time. You've been so generous. And is there anything that's important that you think needs airing before we go? No,
I just you guys are fantastic, and you can repeat that on a loop as many times as you want.
Thanks, Warren. It's such an honor to talk to you, and thanks for giving us MMT.
Sure. Take care.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. You can become a supporter of our work by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. Get in touch with us on Twitter @MMT podcast, or I'm @ChristRiley, spelled ChristReilly. And Patricia is @Patricia N. Pino, spelled PATRICIANPINO. You can also email me at ChristRiley@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you. Is there anything you want me to chop out of this?
No, nothing I've said. Hopefully somebody picks up something that totally discredits me and I never have to do this again.